Jane Carruth's Primer is a 2004 indie movie. It was made on a tiny budget and was far ahead of its time. It was mumblecore before that term had even been coined. It was about trying to create a startup long before The Social Network came out. It's a complex puzzle of a movie that challenges you to try and comprehend what's happening in it and why. If you like it, you'll probably want to watch it multiple times to try and absorb all the pertinent details. The prevailing wisdom when I first saw it is that it should be watched knowing as little as possible going in. For those that haven't seen it, I think I've said enough already. Though, if you want to go watch it, you'll probably accidentally learn more about it just in the process of trying to find a way to see it. From now on, I'm going to spoil the movie, whether you've seen it or not. This is my explanation for the events of Primer. You can easily find lots of explanations for Primer if you go looking. You're likely to come across this image. So why did I feel the need to come up with an explanation of my own? Certain details never sat right with me, and I could never find any explanation that seemed to account for them. The primary motivating example was this.
How many times would it take before he got it right? 3, 4, 20.
The narrator doesn't know exactly how many times Aaron repeated the party, but he seems to believe it could have been a large number, like 20. But how could that be? When I tried to think through the details of how that large number of attempts could actually be made, it never made much sense. So, I thought harder, looked closer, and found various other oddities that I thought warranted interesting explanations. I try to make sense of stories like this so that every detail lines up. After listening to the director's commentary, especially on the topic of the Granger incident, I realized that Carruth probably didn't think about every single detail in such a strict and literal way. So, I very much doubt I'm uncovering any hidden intent subtly hinted at through small details by the creator of this work. Rather, this is a headcanon. I think I've come up with something interesting though, so I'm sharing it. As I said, I wondered how the party could have been repeated a large number of times. For that matter, I wondered about what points in time the multiple versions of Aaron came from, and for what reasons. The narration also has a big part of the mystery, since the narrator must have knowledge of various events in order to describe them, although some are described rather factually.
We can wait this out. But in Abe's mind, he was already compiling the list.
And others sound more like inferences.
At this point, there would have been some discussion.
Then there was the matter of the various incapacitated characters who were removed from the story, but only temporarily. How could the story continue once they were back in the picture? And ultimately, the question of multiple nested time trips had to be tackled. Who would remember what? Who has the upper hand? And who's left struggling to understand? So let's get into those nested time loop dynamics. I approached this question using a thought experiment that I call the clock game. In the clock game, two time travelers meet and each secretly write down one of the hours on a clock. They then compare, and if one is exactly 1 hour later than the other, then the later hour wins. It's like rock, paper, scissors, but it's hard to win and easy to tie. So let's say Aaron turns on a time machine, and then Abe turns on a time machine, and then they play the clock game. Since they're so similar, they both write down 12, and tie. Abe then turns off his time machine and goes back. To keep it simple, let's say time travelers always easily drug and replace their past selves. Abe and Aaron again play the clock game, but Abe remembers Aaron writing 12, so Abe writes 1 and wins. But Aaron also has a time machine, so he turns that off and goes back. What does he find? This is the central question. I'll explore a few possibilities. Thinking from Aaron's perspective, we'd expect Abe to write down a 1 in the clock game. Aaron remembers Abe writing 1, so Aaron writes 2 and wins. Whether Aaron knows it or not, Abe writing that 1 relies on Abe coming out of his time machine with his own memories of that first timeline. Abe would find this new timeline quite surprising, since he remembers Aaron writing 12, that's why he went with a 1. But instead, Aaron wrote a 2. I actually find this to be the least plausible result. I don't think it can work like this. Fundamentally, the reason Aaron writes a 2 is that he came out of a time machine, which happened all the way back here. I think it doesn't make sense for Abe to be surprised in this timeline after coming back in time, because the thing he's surprised by is from an earlier time than he came back to. He only came back this far in time, so why is something from even further back in time different? It seems illogical to me. Everything that happened before Abe exited this time machine is locked in. It can't change. That includes the fact that Aaron turned on his own time machine and no one came out of it. When Aaron comes out of his time machine, it can't be in the same timeline with a time-traveling Abe who remembers Aaron writing a 12. So I don't think Abe can be surprised in this scenario. But when you have nested time loops with the two time travelers who are trying to anticipate each other, someone has to end up surprised by the result. Let's look at another possibility. Aaron comes back, but Abe does not come out of his box. This is original Abe, who writes 12. Aaron writes 2, and is surprised, since he expected 1. Weird. But we have to think it through even more, since this Abe has not used his time machine yet. He'll remember Aaron writing a 2, so he'll go back, intending to write a 3. But when he goes back, which Aaron does he encounter? One who writes a 2 like he expects? Or a different one? Yes, I think it'd be the Aaron that writes 2. Abe gets what he remembers. I seem to be favoring Abe a lot, but I think that's how it works. The person in the inner loop gets to experience what they remembered from their first time around. In this sense, being on the inner loop is better. There are no surprises. On the other hand, the outer loop goes further back in time, so it allows its time traveler to change more of the timeline. But let's try to look at it from Aaron's perspective again. Why doesn't the same reasoning apply to the outer loop? Why shouldn't Aaron experience what he remembered from the first time around? Well, non-rhetorically, why should he? The answer is the logos. That which comes before determines that which comes after. If everything leading up to a moment is the same, then the result of that moment must always be the same. Determinism.
He had but to speak aloud the words that came into his head, and those around him would fall in line.
But time travel demonstrates that reality is not always deterministic. In particular, consider what happens the moment when a box is turned on. Maybe it doesn't open. Maybe someone comes out of it. Maybe someone you didn't even expect comes out of it. You never know. And the key point is, this kind of result is determined by events in some other timeline. All the events chronologically leading up to the moment that a box turns on do not determine what will happen immediately afterwards. It's non-deterministic. So when Aaron comes back in time, then proceeds forward again to the moment Abe's box turns on, the result is not deterministic. There's no guarantee that what happens will be the same thing that happened during Aaron's previous timeline. The only reason to believe that is determinism, which does not apply in this case. So Aaron, whether he knew it or not, was in a timeline where Abe came out of that box intent on writing a 1. But when he repeats this moment, the result may be different. Maybe no one comes out of the box and Abe ends up writing a 12. In fact, let's go back to the very first timeline here. Abe goes back in time, sure, but Aaron also has his time machine. Now he might notice that Abe has disappeared from his timeline, and this might greatly affect his behavior. I'll come back to this much later, but for now, let's say he doesn't notice Abe missing. He'll also go back, expecting Abe to write a 12. In fact, you could swap the order of the moments that they leave from. It doesn't really matter in what order they depart, it only matters what order they arrive. So Aaron would go back and write a 1. Abe, let's say, does not come out of his box and writes his default 12 and loses. But then he goes into his own box intending to write a 2. This succeeds. Non-deterministically, Aaron will experience one of these two timelines. In a certain sense, both of them happen, although not to one single version of Aaron. It's somewhat like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This closely models what we see in the actual movie. Abe and Aaron have some kind of interaction, then Aaron goes back and uses his knowledge of those interactions to try and manipulate the party. He succeeds at this, but eventually Abe also goes back, just not as far back. Abe is on the inner loop, so he remembers what Aaron did, and so in a sense he has the upper hand, while Aaron is surprised. This is not just theoretical. The characters in the movie have to deal with these issues, whether they want to or not. They also form their own theories about these dynamics, and I think it's interesting to consider how they come to their conclusions. Let's dive right into the deep end and talk about the Platt's plan and the ensuing Granger incident. By the way, the Granger incident happens on the night of day 4. Day 1 is when Abe tells Aaron about time travel, and in the evening the party happens. Day 2 is when Abe and Aaron first time travel to trade stocks together. Day 3 is when Abe and Aaron trade stocks again, and Abe hears about Aaron's heroics from the party. On day 4 they trade stocks yet again, and that night the Granger incident happens. Abe stumbles upon a plan to assault Joseph Platts, but then erase all consequences of doing so. The premise is that he was awakened by some kids at night. So, the plan is to go punch Platts, then go back in time. Stand on the street at night to scare the kids away. That way, the whole Platts situation doesn't happen, but that would leave 2 copies of Abe and Aaron hanging around. That leads to the interesting part of the plan. The following day, Abe and Aaron were planning to trade stocks again. That means in the afternoon of that day, they will enter their usual pair of boxes. This is the key.
Yeah, they'll be changed, but at least they'll get back in the box.
In other words, Abe believes that when someone travels back in time, they permanently disappear from that timeline. The time traveler doesn't go back and change the past of their own timeline, they go to a new one altogether. Abe wants to get into one of these timelines that his other time-traveling self abandons. This way, he'll be the only Abe left in that timeline, and all will be well. Likewise for Aaron, of course. Why does Abe believe it works like this? What evidence could have led him to this conclusion?
Are we doing this as an experiment, or are we doing this for me? A little of both.
Although he implies this is an experiment, it's ridiculously high stakes if he's really uncertain how it would turn out. Up until this point, he has been fastidious in trying to keep symmetry, making it impossible to tell whether there's 1 or 2 versions of himself in any given timeline. By maintaining symmetry, it's impossible to tell whether time travel creates a new timeline, or if there's only one timeline, and time travel changes that timeline's past. Earlier on day 4, Aaron did have some shenanigans with his cell phone. I'll return to that incident a bit later, but in short, it wasn't very conclusive.
Are you sure that's how cell phones work? No.
However, I think Abe and Aaron may have been conducting a subtle, more intentional experiment that same day. It wasn't shown directly in the movie at all, although it may have been hinted at very obliquely. It has to do with the locks on the storage units. This scene shows Abe trying to get into the wrong unit. The smarty pants take is that this shows Aaron actually has more time travel experience. But the galaxy brain take is to note that the unit is unlocked. The lock comes right off, it's just for show. It's not actually locked. Why is that? In some contexts it has to be this way. Consider this. Abe starts the box on a timer, closes the door, and leaves. The lock on a door is on the outside. So if he locks the door as he leaves, then whoever comes out of the box is locked in the storage unit. That's no good. So he has to leave it unlocked in the morning. That makes sense. When he goes to turn the box off in the afternoon, he finds it unlocked still. But consider what happens after he goes back in time. He comes out of the box and opens the unit door from the inside since it's unlocked. But why not lock the door behind him after that? After all, he thinks the box may currently contain some version of him.
So, at that point, I, or my double or someone was in the box coming backwards.
And part of the point of using storage units in the first place was to make sure boxes aren't disturbed.
No, safer than a closet. Someplace where someone's not gonna go poking around and messing with it.
And climate control.
So why not lock the door behind him, if only for a bit of security? It's to preserve symmetry. He had already come up to that door later that afternoon and found it unlocked. So he should leave it that way when he comes out of the box in the morning. But what if he did lock it? Then his other self would arrive in the afternoon and find it locked. This is not a big obstacle. He has the key. He can just unlock it. But it would break symmetry. That is, he would create an experience in his other self, which he himself did not have. He never had to unlock the door, but now his other self did. This way, his other self can tell that he is in a timeline where someone has come out of the box and there's a second copy of him out there somewhere. Technically, I'd say when that version of Abe gets into the box and goes back in time, it creates a new timeline where the Abe that comes out of the box remembers having to unlock the door. If that Abe then locks the door behind him after leaving the box in the morning, it re-establishes a symmetric loop where the experience his other self has is the same as the one he had. That timeline creates a new timeline indistinguishable from itself, and so on ad infinitum. So I'd say that on day 4, the day of the Granger incident, Abe and Aaron tried locking the door. Previously, they hadn't done that. On day 3 in particular, it seems like they don't lock the door behind them. But on day 4, they get antsy and they run this little experiment. We're not shown how they handled the lock on day 4, neither in the morning nor in the afternoon. Perhaps mercifully, since we've already seen this happen a bunch of times by this point in the movie. But it leaves the possibility open that they were running this experiment. And based on Abe's reasoning, I think we can tell the result. The experiment is, they resolve to lock the door after they time travel and leave the storage unit in the morning. They experience the result before they actually do this. When they go up to the storage unit in the afternoon, is the door locked or not? If it's locked, it might imply there's a single timeline which they modify each time they time travel. But if it's unlocked, it means that time traveling creates a new timeline. It shows they didn't lock the door in their own past, but rather in a new timeline which they have yet to experience. That, or they for some reason did not lock the door upon exiting, but they can dispel that notion for themselves when they come out of the box 6 hours later and lock the door behind them. As I've explained, based on my understanding, both timelines should happen. In one version of the timeline they find the door unlocked, but in another version they find it locked. There are versions of Aaron and Abe which experience both versions of this timeline. However, the ones we happen to be shown in the movie experience just that first version, where the door is unlocked. I say this because later that same night, Abe expresses belief in time travelers disappearing from their timelines.
Yeah, but at least he'll get back in the box.
This was demonstrated to him by the fact that they found the door unlocked. They found themselves in a timeline which they had intended to alter, but had not yet. This is strong evidence that time travelers do not travel into the past of their own timeline, but rather into a new timeline. One implication of this is that the time travelers permanently disappear from whatever timeline they depart from. Based on this evidence, Abe suggests a way to get rid of the extra copy of him and Aaron. Just wait for them to time travel. Aaron saw the same experiment too, and could act convinced as well. Aaron has of course seen various other complicated evidence, but Abe doesn't know that. I'd actually say that Abe performed this whole experiment just to convince Aaron, because Abe has also seen more evidence that he doesn't want to tell Aaron about, but I'll return to that point soon. Okay, so Abe and Aaron embark on their Platts punching adventure, but are quickly interrupted. They realize there's an extra Thomas Granger in the world. Here, we and they are seeing an effect without its cause, so we can't go far beyond speculation. I will say that I think, despite all protestation...
Just tell me, I promise you. You know I wouldn't. Are you sure you wouldn't? What if it was an emergency? So you do if it was an emergency?
That Aaron had some inkling that he would tell Granger about time travel, or do something like this. His behavior around this incident is bizarre and suspicious.
You're the one he can't get near without passing out.
What happened? Okay, I slipped.
This stuff about Granger passing out only when he's near a specific person and the idea that that's just an inherent consequence of time travel doesn't make any sense to me. I think Aaron is just lying about this stuff to scare and confuse Abe. But I'll return to the motivations of various Aarons at various points in time later. That's an important topic with a lot of nuance. Right now, the point is that Abe is terminally spooked and uses his failsafe machine to go about 4 days back in time. Then he gasses his earlier self. This is what we call Abe 2, gassing Abe 1. Now, why does he want to do this? It's one thing for Aaron to drug his past self. The drugged version, Aaron 1, has no concept of time travel, nor did Aaron set up the time machine that he uses to do this, so he couldn't have prepared for the situation ahead of time. But none of this is true for Abe 1. Abe 1 intentionally created and turned on the failsafe machine. He obviously considered that he might use it. So why would Abe 2 need to be so forceful with Abe 1? Couldn't they coordinate somehow? Wouldn't Abe have set up some way to peaceably interact with his past self in this emergency situation that he clearly prepared for? Yes, I think he would. In fact, I think he'd already done something similar to that. But then Aaron made him rethink this. I'll return to that topic later. First, let's take a close look at Abe's first time travel trip. I think there's a lot more going on with it than it appears at first glance. In the afternoon of day 1, Abe tries to convince Aaron that he's created a time machine. After going through some bizarre motions...
What is it?
Protein buildup.
Okay, can you just tell him?
Protein buildup.
He demonstrates his past self walking into a storage unit. Therefore, he's already gone back in time, and this is his second attempt at living this particular afternoon.
What'd you do all day? First time through.
I spent the day in a hotel room with Russell.
He claims he was in the hotel the first time around. I think this is true, but in a deviously false way. To begin all this, we're treated with this memorable shot. But why is he up here? Really? He should be coming down to meet Aaron, not going up. Nor does it seem like he even calls down to Aaron, saying something like, "Be right there," even though he can see him down there. Rather, I think this is part of his time travel plot. He has set up a discreet way to interact with his past self and attempt 2 different ways to convince Aaron about time travel. Let's say he's on the roof at noon. He's looking down at this scene. Then let's say at 12:15 he finally comes down and talks to Aaron. But he hasn't time traveled yet. This is what I call his plan A.
Look, I was gonna come give you this big speech about how we've been friends for a long time and built up trust and that whole big thing.
He tried to appeal to Aaron's trust in him. We never see this, but I don't think it went too well. I think Aaron's initial reaction was skeptical at best.
What the hell, Abe? You could have just shown me the pictures.
I want you to believe it.
Believe what? The protein? I believe you.
After separating from Aaron, he gets a call from Rachel and he tells her about Robert's birthday party. Maybe he says he'll be there. Anyway, he ultimately decides he didn't like how this day went, and he gets into a time machine for the first time. This isn't his failsafe, it's the other one, which he can openly show Aaron. He disappears back in time. The idea here is that he already thought of a second approach, Plan B.
But how about this instead? If you ditch work this afternoon and promise to do the few small things that I ask you, I will in return show you the most important thing that any living organism has ever witnessed.
He will just walk Aaron through the same steps he himself went through and not appeal to his emotions at all.
So I said screw it and I put my watch in there.
And?
I want you to do it.
Wait, digital or old mechanical?
Exactly. I did both.
And what?
I want you to do it.
He comes down at noon and talks to Aaron. This is roughly what we see in the movie. His past self is on the roof, looking down, and sees himself talking to Aaron at noon. This is his cue to buzz off. He set this up ahead of time, resolving that if he sees himself down there, it means Plan A didn't go well and his other self is doing Plan B. Now this past Abe really does skip town and hang around in a hotel. He still needs to come back and get into the box in the storage unit. This was always part of Plan B, and perhaps he even had a Plan C, which could be what the failsafe machine is about. Abe is quite cautious sometimes.
We can still be careful. Maybe we can get to the gun without him knowing.
While in the hotel, he turns his phone off. Similarly, I think his other self, who's enacting Plan B with Aaron, has also turned his phone off so he can focus, since he can't as easily redo it this time. Because of this, Rachel is unable to call him. He turns his phone back on after the big finale of his demonstration. Rachel finally gets a call through and he ends up telling her about the party again. So that phone call happened a slightly different way in this timeline than it did the first time around, though not substantially. The big wrinkle here is that this is really not what we see in the movie, because in everything I just described there, he's dealing with an Aaron who is innocent of time travel, Aaron 1. In the movie this is not the case. The Aaron shown has actually already snuck back in time. So how does that Aaron deal with Abe's own relatively minor Day 1 time loop shenanigans? This is where the nested loop dynamics can really start to come into play. I'll begin boldly and say that Aaron's discovery of the failsafe machine is actually tied to this first time loop of Abe's. In the Plan A timeline, Abe goes back in time. But that timeline continues even though Abe has disappeared from it. He will eventually be missed, but first Robert's birthday party happens, and the gunman incident happens without Aaron in attendance. Aaron does hear about it afterwards. He also eventually sees that Abe is nowhere to be found. Now, Abe did tell Aaron about time travel, but Aaron was skeptical. But now he starts to believe. In the course of investigating what may have happened to Abe, he gets a look at his storage manifest that describes Abe's rentals. This helps explain why Aaron is even looking at this document in the first place. So Aaron goes and checks out these units. In one, he finds a box turned off. This is what Abe went back in time in. In the other, he finds the failsafe machine, still on, and with a somewhat longer timer on it. Aaron understands and decides to use it. He builds a new box of his own, folds it up, and brings it with him in Abe's failsafe box. Immediately after exiting Abe's failsafe, he turns the failsafe off. This cements Aaron's place in the timeline. He also decides to record his actions for the day, just in case.
He had already performed the task as I had intended to, of recording the conversations of the day just in case.
He remembers the gunman incident and wants to use his knowledge to change what happens. He sets up his own box, which he might decide to use later to come back with his recordings. I'll call this Aaron's failsafe. Only after this does he let Abe's failsafe turn on. This will put Abe in the innermost loop, if and when he uses his failsafe. Aaron then goes home and drugs his past self. The Aaron that came back in time is called Aaron 2, and the Aaron that is drugged is called Aaron 1. In interacting with Abe after this, since Aaron 2 doesn't want Abe to disappear into his box again, he tries to act a bit more accepting of what Abe is telling him. But he doesn't act too differently, since he's trying to recreate the events of the day somewhat. In other words, this is still all the Plan A timeline for Abe, but is Aaron's more accepting attitude good enough to mollify Abe? It's not. He can go back with relative ease to try Plan B, so he does. Note this leaves Aaron once again in an Abe-less timeline, although we never get to see how Aaron reacts to that. Abe, meanwhile, tries Plan B, and Aaron 2 is surprised to find him acting quite differently from how he did the first time. Maybe Aaron 2 grasps what's happening here, and this is his first taste of non-determinism. He'd come back to before Abe turned on the box for the day, and the result of turning that box on is not deterministic. Plan B Abe is a different result than Aaron 2 had previously seen, as Aaron 1. Abe is ultimately satisfied with his Plan B, so it continues on from there. This whole clown show actually repeats a second time though, since Aaron comes back a second time. In both cases, Aaron gets to experience Abe's Plan A, but we never get to see those timelines. All Aarons we see experience Plan B timelines. The bigger point for me is that Abe can be quite hard to please. Even with Aaron 2 trying to act a bit more accepting, Abe still decides to go back in time and try Plan B, since it's not too hard for him to do so. And Abe being hard to please is also the cause of there being so many Aarons. Aaron 2 had set up his own failsafe, just in case he thinks he can do something better. He also recorded the conversations of the day in case it's useful. The Aaron that comes back the second time using Aaron's failsafe and already has the recording is called Aaron 3. In a later scene, Aaron 3 claims that, when he was Aaron 2, he rushed the gunman.
Didn't never fires, not even when you rushed him. No, he didn't the time I wasn't there. He didn't time I was when I rushed him.
I'd say what happened there was, he attends the party, heroically confronts the gunman, and makes him flee in fear and shame. This makes Aaron feel powerful, big. He's treated as a hero.
Wait, what did you call him?
Doesn't it seem very dangerous to confront an armed person like that? Yes, and I'll get back to the details of that later. But in short, right after doing that, Aaron 2 was really feeling the power of time travel. He's above normal people. He's above consequences. The only person he can possibly relate to is Abe. For various reasons, he wants the two of them to run away from this normal life they have and have time travel adventures together. The Punching Plats plan is just a small taste of the kinds of experiences they can have, but then avoid the consequences after. But Abe is not pleased. He's unimpressed with what Aaron 2 did at the party. Sure, Aaron 2 got to feel powerful in the moment, but all he really accomplished is humiliating the gunman. He's still out there, angry and emotionally sore, and Abe fears what he might do next as a result of this. Abe doesn't think Aaron accomplished nearly enough.
At the end of the night, this guy is arrested and goes to jail. That's the way it goes. Your words, not mine.
So Aaron figures, fine, he can go back a second time and do it a bit differently. He does this on his own without telling Abe about it. He uses his failsafe and brings his recordings with him. Aaron's first attempt was mostly good, but this time he won't chase the gunman off. After successfully rushing him, he basically needs to grab him and sit on him and call the cops. When the cops arrive and see the physical evidence, they'll arrest him, and that should be a much better outcome that will please Abe better. That's why Aaron goes back the second time, and does so relatively early, on day 2 or 3. We actually see that timeline in the movie. Abe learns about the results of Aaron's actions on day 3.
God, especially now to risk anything would be completely crazy. I know. The thing is, I know you know that, but
And once again, he is not pleased. Aaron has repeatedly gone back and done all this stuff, trying to do good and eventually use it to show Abe the kinds of things they could do with their newfound power. But it's just never good enough for Abe. Meanwhile, Abe has also started talking about spreading the knowledge of time travel to Aaron's wife Kara, and even their startup partners Philip and Robert.
I'm not telling them a thing about this. We're not.
By this point, I think Aaron is beginning to get pretty sick of Abe's shit. Eventually, I think he gives up on the idea of having Abe along on his time travel adventures. He'd rather just do it alone. I think he starts to act out a bit and try to spook Abe. The business with the cell phone is a small example of this. That's also why I said he considered the drastic step of bringing Granger into the fold something to really scare Abe and make him leave this timeline. That actually succeeded. After seeing Granger, Abe retreated into his failsafe, leaving Aaron alone in the timeline. I think by that point, Aaron was quite happy with that outcome and flew far away and spent the rest of his life doing whatever crazy stuff he wanted. He probably punched Platts as his last bit of business in town. Now, if you're following along closely, hopefully you'll have some concerns about this story I'm telling. After all, the narrator in the movie describes the Granger incident.
The question should have been what to do with the comatose man in the guest bedroom.
But how is this possible? I'm saying the Aaron who experienced the Granger incident stayed in that timeline. Plus, I'm saying Aaron 2 and Aaron 3, who had this struggle against each other, both came back from only the first few days, not the Granger incident day 4. Nor did either of them get a chance to speak with Abe 2 before their struggle. The narrator says he's some sort of Aaron.
I understood that he simply wanted it more, that he just had more invested. So I left.
But none of these Aarons know anything about the Granger incident. So what am I saying here? Believe me, I will return to this question. First, let's look at Abe 2's actions. His first order of business after exiting the failsafe is to gas his past self with nitrous oxide. As I've already said, the fact that he does this is quite strange. Wouldn't he plan for some way to cooperate with his past self? And if he had, why isn't he following the plan? The reason is that Aaron convinced him it's a bad idea. Abe has just come from a timeline where he deals with Aaron 3, who has already struggled against his past self, Aaron 2. During that timeline, Abe and Aaron seem to spend a decent amount of time considering how they could possibly enact a plan to punch Platts.
Look, Abe, you don't have to tell me not doing this, okay?
Aaron emphasizes it's a bad idea. In other words, attempting to reason and cooperate with your past self is a bad plan and a losing proposition. The Platts plan Abe eventually does cook up does not involve directly interacting with their past selves at all.
So that way my double sleeps through the night, they don't have the conversation we're having now, and they get in the box tomorrow as usual.
I'm not saying Aaron 3 told Abe about his own time-traveling exploits, but he did manage to convince him of the lesson that he learned from them.
Abe, I'm not either, okay? But what's worse? Thinking you're being paranoid or knowing you should be?
That's why Abe 2 abandons whatever plan he may have had for cooperating with Abe 1 and just uses force instead. But didn't Aaron 3 succeed at dealing with his past self? He did, but it wasn't easy, and it was nothing like he expected.
Because when Aaron came back the second time, it wasn't so easy. He wasn't expecting me to put up a fight.
It seems Aaron 3 expected he could talk to Aaron 2 and come to an easy agreement. Remember that Aaron 2 set up Aaron 3's time machine and this whole plan when he was quite new to time travel. But in fact, they had no easy agreement. Neither deferred to the other. They each felt like their own person who didn't owe anything to the other. In fact, I bet Aaron 3 didn't win this struggle in any way when he initially returned. It seems like the loser of the struggle has to go away and leave town. Well, Aaron 3 went away, and then went right back into his time machine, Aaron's failsafe. He went back the 1 hour or however long it was, and tried it again. Repeating a physical struggle consistently only gets harder and harder, but convincing rhetoric is relatively easy to repeat, so he kept retrying it until he found an argument that convinced Aaron 2 to leave. But wait, how is it possible for him to try that over and over? Did he keep making new time machines each time and taking them back with him? Were there more and more copies of himself that he had to deal with as a result? No. He employed one of the dirtiest maneuvers in time travel. He turned off a box, which he had already come out of, and entered it again in order to go back a second time. This creates a new timeline where this double-looped person comes out of the box instead of the previous version of that person. That previous person doesn't show up in this new timeline at all. They could only show up when the box turns on, but now this new version of them has come out of the box instead. It's basically a way to take a mulligan and completely redo a time travel trip that you already did. I call this fictional process evacipation.
Evacipate.
This can be done repeatedly, using the same time machine over and over. By repeatedly evacipating himself as needed, Aaron 3 kept retrying his struggle with Aaron 2 until he found something that worked. Imagine his annoyance then when he finds that his recording doesn't even work.
I hope you're not implying that any day is unimportant to Cortex Semi.
Of course, it did work in one timeline, but then Abe used his failsafe and came back and invalidated it. Since Abe 2 has the smaller inner loop, he remembers how this conversation with Aaron 3 went, but is not obligated to follow along. He's actually too exhausted to do anything clever with the situation, but in principle, he has the upper hand here and can predict Aaron 3's actions. He would win the clock game. Abe 2 and Aaron 3 then have their little chit-chat, and then Aaron is right back to setting up the party.
Got a schedule.
Recall that this Aaron has just come back in time in an effort to use his time travel powers to make something good happen and impress Abe. He does not yet know that this won't even be up to Abe's standards. But if he doesn't get the gunman arrested that same night, he'll just evacipate himself again, going back to the start of the day. This method erases his past attempt entirely, so it doesn't leave an attic full of 20 drugged Aarons. Nor, even if he somehow manages to cooperate with his past selves, does it leave 20 versions of Aaron all hiding around the world. Neither of these possibilities make much sense to me. But if you allow for evacipation, then it does make sense. Also, each time he does this, I think he would end up interacting with Abe 1 again, but we never get to see that. What we do see is that he continues to try and get Abe 2 in on his plans. This version of Aaron is still trying to convince Abe that time travel lets them do great things and have amazing experiences. Plus, they don't need to live with the consequences of their actions. They can run away, physically or temporally if need be. Aaron had no interest in the long-term consequences of a drugged copy of himself in the attic. He always intended to leave town one way or another before long. So by this point, the purpose of manipulating the party isn't even to get the treatment of a hero, which he could only enjoy for a couple of days at most. The main purpose is just to demonstrate to Abe that it's possible. Check out them discussing Abe's hesitation. We have what, on the surface, sounds like a weird non sequitur. They're talking about how to manipulate the party, but then Abe suddenly switches the topic to their handwriting.
Maybe we can get to the gun without him knowing. We definitely can. I mean, he leaves it in the truck before he goes in. I mean, we don't even need to, but if it makes you feel better,
What's wrong with our hands?
what do you mean?
Why can't we write like normal people?
But it makes sense if you consider the broader topic they're discussing. The details of the party itself are not really that important, but rather they're discussing the concept of being time travelers. Aaron manages to convince Abe that this specific good deed can be accomplished with time travel, so Abe moves on to discuss a downside of what they now are. Aaron is still trying to get a companion for his time travel adventures, and Abe remains skeptical. As a brief aside, in this scene Abe has a different tie than the one he has in the morning and at the party. Contrast to Aaron, who consistently wears this Jund tie all day. I think what's really happening here is a production mistake. Abe has that different tie in this much earlier scene, which is in the same location and a similar time of day. So I think these two scenes were filmed back to back and they didn't pay close enough attention to wardrobe. But my headcanon is that this is a tiny rebellion from Abe, intentionally putting on a different tie to try and say he's not going along with the predetermined plan. Until he's convinced otherwise. Anyway, let's look at some more interesting details. Abe pitches unloading the gun up front, and Aaron agrees to it. Why? After all, they don't know for sure, but it seems likely the gunman will check if the gun is loaded before bringing it into the house. If he finds it's not loaded, to his surprise, he might give up on this whole idea for now and just leave. That's okay for the time being, but only kicks the can down the road. It's similar to not inviting Rachel to the party at all.
Or better yet, not even talk to her at all, and she won't even know about the party.
Yeah, Abe, that's good for tonight. What about tomorrow? And every other day?
Take care of tomorrow.
Yeah, you'll watch her all the time.
Aaron is against that, so why does he go with this unloading plan? He seems to know that the truck is unlocked too. I think it was always part of Aaron's plan to unload the gun. It's another example of one of the guys thinking they have a new idea, but the other one has actually led them to it.
Abe, you know what we could use? Look.
In fact, even Aaron too unloaded the gun, when it was his turn. That's why he felt confident rushing the gunman the first time around.
Didn't never fires, not even when you rushed him. No.
He knew he couldn't get shot. Furthermore, why is Abe even at this party? He wasn't there in the Abe 1 Aaron 3 timeline. He only heard what happened at the party 2 days later.
Wait, what did you call him?
Yet here Abe and Aaron are, with their earbuds in their ears. What use could Aaron's recordings possibly be? Shouldn't having this other person there have a big effect on the conversation? But they go along unperturbed. Aaron and Abe even both have their earbuds in at the moment Aaron goes to confront the gunman. What more is there to listen to at that point? I can only conclude that the recordings are essentially worthless. The key point is that Rachel and the gunman need to be invited, and that Aaron unloads the gun beforehand. Everything else will proceed more or less the same way, without micromanaging any of the details. Essentially, the only thing Aaron 3 achieves by coming back a second time is to make sure to try and restrain the gunman until the police arrive. The rest of the details turn out to be a waste of time. He did it like this to try and impress Abe, and it still wasn't enough. After this, we're treated to a scene of Abe and Aaron in the familiar hotel. I understand emotionally that Aaron is contented, but Abe is haunted. But logistically, why are they here? Abe still has the same tie, so I think it's later that same night. Normally, they use this hotel to take themselves out of the picture for stock trading trips. But what are they doing here now? I think it's due to Abe having a gassed copy of himself in his bathroom. He's not ready to go home and deal with that. Plus, it may be too late. He was knocked out with nitrous oxide, which only works as long as it's administered.
But the small tank of medical grade nitrous oxide would be needed on the other side.
How long can Abe be kept strapped to a small tank before it runs out and he starts breathing normal air again? I don't know. Maybe not that long. So for that night, Abe and Aaron stick together and stay in their usual hotel. But despite everything Aaron has tried, Abe is not pleased with any of this. He hates it, in fact. He then commits the filthiest time travel shenanigans in the whole movie. He does to Aaron what Aaron did to him, but even worse. He goes to the storage place and finds Aaron's storage unit and uses Aaron's failsafe. I call the person who does this Abe 3. However, this is the time machine that Aaron 3 had already come out of earlier in the day. So, Abe 3 actually evacipates Aaron 3. He came out of the same box that Aaron 3 used, and at the same time, thus reaching a timeline where there is no Aaron 3. This also allowed Abe to go further back than his own failsafe. He then had to move fast to clean everything up as much as he could. First, he turns off the machine he just came out of, ensuring that he himself could not be evacipated. He then had to hurry over to his own storage unit with his own failsafe, whose timer had not yet turned it on. He disabled his timer, so that machine never turns on in the first place. He didn't need yet another copy of himself in this timeline. Next, he needed to rush over to Aaron's place to intercept Aaron 2. Unlike Aaron 3, Abe did not want to wait until Aaron 1 was drugged. Just the opposite. He needed to intercept Aaron 2 to convince him not to drug his past self. He managed to convince him. After some debriefing, we get the scene in the airport. In other words, this scene does not happen after the party. It happens early on day 1. I think that actually makes a lot more sense. No one wants to deal with this timeline where there are drugged people emerging from deep within their own homes. It's a strange, unpredictable situation. Yet they talk about it like it's so predictable.
They'll be building their own boxes in another day, and yours already knows what they built.
How can they know how these people will behave? How do they have this timetable? It's because they're actually at the start of day 1, and they haven't interfered with anyone. Thanks to Abe 3's quick action, no one is drugged. Left to their own devices, Abe 1 and Aaron 1 are going to go on their merry, innocent stock trading trip one day from now. This is the prediction Aaron so confidently makes, but Abe thinks he can indirectly convince himself otherwise.
He's got it wired wrong. And if they fix that, I'll start actually taking pieces out of it. It's just a gimmick. It doesn't work anymore.
Now, if he's actually talking about an Abe who woke up gassed in his bathroom, I don't see how that could possibly be the case. After all, that Abe built and turned on the failsafe machine. After doing that, and then mysteriously losing a bunch of time, waking up strapped to a nitrous tank, could he really ever be convinced that time travel doesn't work? It seems like the obvious conclusion for him would be that some future version of him came out of that time machine and did this. But if he wasn't gassed, and he had never even time traveled himself, then he could be convinced.
It's just a gimmick. It doesn't work anymore.
That makes a lot more sense to me. Abe 3 tells Aaron 2 a bunch of things about this situation they're now in. Aaron 2 has had very little experience himself, but I think the secondhand news catches him up pretty quickly. He certainly appreciates the power of time travel, even if not yet firsthand. He wants no more of this normal life, and once again tries to get Abe to come with him. But Abe's not having it, of course. Aaron flies off alone. In fact, I think the Aaron in this airport scene is the narrator, the one who makes the phone call. Most of the information he relays is secondhand, things he's heard from Abe 3.
I can tell you with certainty what I did that night when it was my turn. But I think it would do little good.
His own experiences aren't really that relevant. Plus, since he's personally performed so few time shenanigans in this timeline, he can afford to be quite self-righteous about the concept.
I've decided to believe that only one more would have done it. I can almost sleep at night if there's only one more.
He refers to the Aaron 2 that was convinced to leave as himself, since, well, they pretty much are the same person, just a few hours different. For those keeping close score, Aaron 2 ends up experiencing 3 different results from the failsafe machine he himself sets up. One where no one comes out of it, and he gets to go make his recordings. One where he comes out of it with those recordings, Aaron 3. And then finally, one where evacipating Abe comes out of it, Abe 3. No one version of Aaron 2 experiences all of this, of course, but it all happens in some sense and leaves an impact on Abe's memories, which he relays to Aaron. This helps explain why the description of the Granger incident sounds like it's directly from Abe's perspective.
But in Abe's mind, he was already compiling the list.
The big info dump from Aaron to Abe is described inferentially as something that would have happened.
Abe would, of course, want to know how.
Presumably indicating that Abe didn't directly describe this conversation. However, based on everything Abe knew about Aaron 3, Aaron 2 concludes the conversation must have happened. The fact that he refers to the Aaron 2 who lost the struggle as himself shows how he still identifies with this hypothetical person who kept getting yanked around by more experienced time travelers. In both timelines, he comes to essentially the same conclusion. He wants no more of this, and leaves. This phone call he's making, which frames the whole movie, is a form of repayment.
Now I have repaid any debt I may have owed you.
It's not terribly clear who it's addressed to, But I'd actually guess it's Abe 1. After all, he really owes nothing to Aaron 1. He hasn't taken anything from him, except a passport. But Abe, on the other hand, even if he puts it harshly, makes a good point.
And I don't think there's ever been any reason for me to show you what I'm capable of.
Abe did give Aaron the gift of knowledge of time travel, and now Abe 1, that very same Abe who wanted to give him that gift, is being gaslit by his future self into letting this power slip from his hands. Aaron makes it up to him with this phone call. Furthermore, since Abe 1 did create the failsafe box, he seems the person by far most likely to actually believe in time travel after receiving this phone call. As for Abe's own motivations, Aaron drops a huge bomb on us in one of the final lines of the movie.
Tell you what, why don't you take Karen and Lauren and put them in the box? And then you and Aaron can each keep a set, and you'll both have families, and you can stop feeding off it.
He makes it sound like Abe is obsessed with Aaron's family. He does seem oddly involved in Aaron's home life, washing dishes, going grocery shopping. But this one line from Aaron implies a serious obsession far beyond any other evidence I can find. Yet Abe makes no denial of it. It also reminds us that Aaron himself is completely abandoning his wife and daughter. He is well and truly finished with his normal life and wants to go do something different. But we can already see that. This is only a reminder. The statement it makes about Abe is much more telling.
I guess that it just won't go back far enough, will it?
What does Aaron actually mean by this? Abe's gone quite far back. He's cleaned up pretty much all fallout from the rest of the movie, except for Aaron here, who was about to leave anyway. So what more could be accomplished by going even further back? So maybe Aaron means going years back. Between all the things Aaron says here, maybe we can infer that there was some kind of missed opportunity between Aaron's eventual wife Kara and Abe. Abe wishes he can go back and do it differently, but this is the best he can get now. So that's pretty much how I interpret this movie. In short, time travel creates new timelines. You can redo a time travel attempt. This power changes Aaron's entire perspective on life, and he wants to leave his old life behind. He wants to bring Abe with him until he realizes he actually sort of hates Abe. Abe, meanwhile, is desperately attached to his mundane life, and is wary of the uncontrollable outcomes of time travel, except perhaps for cold hard cash. He manages to undo most of the effects by the end of the movie. As a sort of appendix, I also want to talk a bit about how Aaron can have time travel-fueled adventures in whatever foreign lands he decides on. This will mostly be detailed descriptions of fictional time travel mechanics. We see Aaron seeming to construct a large time machine, but what's the use of it? Sure, if anything ever goes wrong, he can comfortably go back a long way. He can avoid the consequences of his actions, whether they're unforeseen or even if they're entirely predictable. But this isn't the get-out-of-jail-free card. If he does go back in time like that, there will still be 2 copies of him. Much of the difficulty in this movie stems from that core problem of trying to deal with your past self. It's never really solved over the course of the movie. The closest thing to a solution is evacipation, but that's only a partial answer. Aaron can evacipate himself as many times as he wants, but that only replaces the time-traveling version of himself. The slightly younger version is always still there and remains an unsolved problem. Well, actually, I think it is possible to create a single-copy self-evacipation machine. In other words, there will only be one copy of the time traveler at practically all times, and yet they can also go back in time repeatedly. And no, this doesn't involve anyone dying. I've thought of a couple ways to do it, actually. One way involves a never-mentioned but thoroughly plausible mechanism. It's something to turn the box off on a timer, rather than turn it on a timer. I see no reason there couldn't be a device like that. With that in hand, here's the procedure. Turn on the box, with a timer to turn it off after some period. Get in the box immediately after turning it on.
Alright, we start the machine with a Weeble at the AM.
Inside the box, wait for twice the length of the period for which the box will be active. Halfway through this, the timer will turn the box off, but you won't exit. You'll start going backwards. After waiting the full time to go all the way back, exit the box. You've now evacipated yourself, and you're right back where you started. However, you can always enter this box when it turns off, and evacipate yourself once again. There's never more than one copy of you, and you can go back repeatedly. In fact, you don't even need to limit yourself to entering the box at the moment that the timer turns it off. You can disable the timer after completing your initial loop. So for example, set the timer to turn the box off after just half an hour. Get in the box and wait a full hour, then exit. After you exit, disable the timer. Now the box will run indefinitely. You can turn the box off whenever it's convenient for you, and get in and go back to this moment. The only limitation is how long you can survive in the box, which really stops being an issue with a big, room-sized box. I also thought of a different method. In a way, this second method only works some of the time, but in another sense it always works. It doesn't use any extra devices, instead it relies on details of nested loop dynamics. It just involves creating a simple nested loop with 2 time machines. Here's the procedure. Turn on a time machine. A little while later, turn on a second time machine. Then go to a hotel or whatever. Come back and turn off the second time machine and get in. When you come out of it in the past, sit around at home for a while, and then later, go turn off the first time machine and get in that. After you go back in time this greater distance, just watch what happens with the second time machine. What does happen? It's non-deterministic. On the one hand, you may see your past self doing what you yourself did, turning on the machine, then immediately coming out of it, then one version of you eventually disappears into the second machine, then the other copy disappears into the first. There were temporarily 3 copies of you, but it got whittled down to 1 by the end. Nothing bad happened here, but nothing useful happened either. This is the failure case. The other thing you might see is, your past self turns on the second time machine, but no one comes out of it. Eventually the other you turns off the machine and disappears into it. Now you are the only version of you remaining, but the first time machine is still running, and no one's going to turn it off. This is now a single copy self-evacipation machine. Whenever you feel like it, you can turn this machine off and get in. This will take you back to the start of the loop. By now, it's abundantly clear that I've thought about this a lot. This is the headcanon I came up with. I think it's quite interesting, both in its hard science fiction aspects as well as in its character arcs. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about it.